the side of the house that he now lives in. And it's rather old, and so that ramp is about 8 inches of clearance from the porch, concrete porch below it. And a swarm of honeybees decided to make that their home. And so the bad thing about stepping out the door, there you are. And so Renee's been stung. And so the project today was to have Bill's brother-in-law, who's an elder in South Knoxville, a very talented carpenter, come over and do a lot of work on that porch. He is wore out. And so there's no taping tonight of the lesson that we had planned on evangelism. And so we will do something else. I was talking to Rita on the way over, what do you recommend? And she says, well, maybe if you want to start out, questions. I know we're talking about evangelism, and we've had a lot to say about that. Before I get into some other subjects that we can talk about, does anybody here have any question at all about evangelism or a comment about evangelism, something that you've learned that you think might be helpful to those here? Any question about evangelism? Yeah, that's hard, and one of the things that we'll do over the course of the course is to be able to give you conversation starters. In times past, we passed it out as a class, things that you could ask someone that's not going to be offensive, things that will cause them to start thinking about religious things, and then to find out where they are. You know, people from time to time can get in what I call the right mood for perhaps a study of the Bible. There was one of the things we did this morning. I'm now, as I mentioned Sunday, teaching another quarter. There are 6 students this time, new students, who are involved in the class. 3 of them are 21 years of age. One's in his mid-20s, one 43, and there's a 51-year-old man who was an industrial engineer for years and now decided he wants to spend the last part of his life being a gospel preacher. The one particular young man who was living in the Nashville area, he had been involved in a very large denominational gathering that had a Bible study with about 30 college students on a regular basis. And he started talking about baptism with a particular friend and went home and started studying it. And then he brought that to the class, and the class disagreed with what he was saying, his conclusions. And he said, well, the Bible does say this. And then he goes home and starts looking on the internet, and he found GBN. Anybody know what that is? The Gospel Broadcasting Network out of South Haven that's been going on for a number of years, and saw some videos. He saw that video several times, wrote down every Bible verse and the questions he had on that, and took it back and shared that with 30 people in the class, and it did not go well for him. Just about everybody there told him where he was wrong, and he got mad, they got mad, and went home and studied some more, and so he called GBN, they got a number, and somebody called him back, and they said, you need to go see this contact in Nashville, a gospel preacher, a faithful congregation, met him, and he became a Christian 2 years ago, and now is at school full-time to be a gospel preacher. And so the gospel still is the power to save, Romans chapter 1, verse 16. But he got in the mood. Before he wasn't that interested. There are a number of students there who were raised in the church and weren't really that active. And sometimes they would talk about something happened that initiated a greater study leading to decision to become a Christian or to become a more fervent Christian, to start being active in the church, and then lead it to the point where they want to be a gospel preacher. So you never know. That's one of why you don't give up. It's sometimes people, I mentioned in times past, if you look at Matthew 13, how many different kind of souls are there? Anybody know from study? There's 4 different kind of souls, and the good soul is the last, and not everybody's in there. Can someone go from being a wayside soul or a thorny soul to a good soul? What would happen? Well, generally, and as I mentioned to the students time and time again, it's been my observation down through the years, and I'm sure Phil and others that have studied, and Cordell and Donnie, that generally a lot of times the people who are interested enough to study with me, something's going on in their life and they don't like it. There's hurt there, and they realize they can't take care of it on their own, and they're hoping Jesus can. And so find a hurt and heal it has always been a way for congregations to grow and for individuals to grow. So what Cordell said is certainly true. Other comments or questions regarding evangelism? What is evangelism? I appreciate Steve's lesson a couple of weeks ago when I was in town. You know, a lot of times they mention evangelism, you think of door knocking, or maybe those who are older of having a Jill Miller film strip that you'd go and it's limited to that. That's not the case at all. Anything that will advance the knowledge of Jesus in someone's life can be helpful. You're living the Christian life at work in front of someone, does that help? It might if they were to compliment you on your life and how different it is and how much better it is, how inspiring it is. What would be a response that's needed? If somebody notices something about your life that's commendable, that they admire, they respect you for, how do you tie that in? That's right. It's giving the glory. In the closing verses, the closing verse of Acts chapter 2, there's kind of a two-part summary of what caused the Lord's church. Well, they were adding people every day. Anybody know what those are without looking? Two things were mentioned that the church at Jerusalem was doing, and the Lord added to the church daily, such as those who are being saved. I know you've heard that verse. Anybody know what two things are mentioned there? Look at it if you know. Acts 2, verse 47. What two things were mentioned about that congregation that led to growth? There's a two-word action item mentioned, and then a particular something else that was characteristic of the congregation and the response to the community. What are the two things that contributed to the growth of the church? Praising God and having favor of the people. So the first one, as I mentioned, you know, if you're in a situation where someone looks at your life, and Christians should be concerned about their influence. Matthew 5, be the salt of the earth, be the light of the world. It talks about influence, and do recognize something significant and noteworthy about your life that's admirable, that's inspiring. Don't just say, well, thanks, I appreciate that. I mean, what do you need to do? Why are you different? Why are you better? Why does your marriage work? Well, if you've applied Christian principles, then, as has been mentioned there, give the glory to God. How do you do that? Sometimes it may be in denominational settings, people think it's about swaying to the music, going to a big rock concert that has overtone. That's what praising God is. But what do you think is included in Acts 2, verse 47? Praising God. And then we'll look at the other one. What would constitute praising God? Not just in worship. Can you do it outside of worship? Yes. What would that be? Okay, living the Christian life, walking as best you can, having that walk with the Lord. Turn to the book of 1 Peter chapter 2. That's another what I call Great Commission passage. I require that as memory work for the class I teach on evangelism. There are 4 terms that identify different aspects of what the local congregation, what the church should be. This is kind of, if you know the book of Exodus, chapter 19, chapter 20 lists the 10 Commandments, but chapter 19 gives a purpose of the law. And if you look at that chapter, then you'll see the similarity between what God expected the Jewish nation to be, serving him under the 10 Commandments and the one today. You, the church, are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people. Why? If you live that, there should be an attraction there. Then the last part of that verse, if you want to organize it, is the part where you proclaim. What are you proclaiming? What's mentioned in the last part? That you may proclaim the praises of him who did what? Well, that's what the Lord's done for you, enable you to know about the Christian life, to become a Christian life. And that's what every single Christian in congregations need to be trained to do, and answer the question, why are you a Christian to begin with? What is it about Christianity now? There are people that I know that said, I just can't talk, but if you find their subject, they can talk about it. But Christians, if they're studied and growing, as Cordell said, as they grow, they should recognize what God has done for them in their life, the changes that have been made, the blessings that have been experienced, and then pass that on and give God the credit. So if Christians would do that, I've known people who may not been very effective one-on-one Bible teachers, but they can tell you about why they're a Christian. They can tell you what God has done in their life. And one of the things that we had a recent discussion on Thursday morning, in times past I was raised that you really do testimonials when you teach, you just keep with the scriptures, but I don't certainly agree with that at all. If Christianity has affected your life and you have a story, I believe that should be shared. Now, preachers shouldn't do that all the time, but did the Apostle Paul ever share his story of his conversion? In the book of Acts, Luke records it 3 times. In the book of Acts, to tell what happened. I was on the road to Damascus, and what did God do? And so I've been able to tell how your life has been made different. What was the motivation for David praising God? Look at Psalm 63, as I mentioned before. It's one of my favorite Psalms. Look at verse 3. What was David's motivation for praising God? Because such and such, my lips shall praise thee. What was it? See, the steadfast love, or some versions, because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise. What do you mean by that? If you've seen God's love shed abroad in your heart, then why would you not want to tell people? If you've been on the receiving end of God's goodness and God's grace, why would you not want to tell that? And I look at the book of Ephesians chapter 3. We've mentioned this passage so many times. When Paul writes to the church at Ephesus, to a church that had been established for years, he has a particular prayer request for them. Starts with verse 14. We'll drop on down to verse 17. He's praying that Christ may dwell in their hearts through faith, but then they be rooted and grounded in love. Then he says that you may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. How old do you have to be before you begin to recognize somebody's fond of you or an expression of love? How old does a human being have to be before they can begin to want somebody? What's that? As soon as they're born. Rita's not in here, but I've got 2 grandsons. They're 5 months old. And the oldest, Jason, the first 3 months was very colicky. I mean, when you give him the bottle, he's going to cry because it hurt his stomach so much. And Rita, having raised 2 children of her own, and one of those kids was colicky, she knows what babies need and the position on, she just knows how to comfort, knows how to console. And now to this day, he's 5 months old and he gets to do this now. When Rita walks through the door, because, my schedule with Rachel now going to work and Vlad at work, I get them from about 3 to 5:30. By myself. Then Rita gets there about 5:30. As soon as that door opens up, even today, there's little Jason looking over, who have been playing with him and having fun. He sees her walk through the door, and what does his eyes do? Now, she grabbed Josh first. Can a 5-month-old baby be jealous? He is. Why? Because babies love to be held and note affection and understand love at a very early age, as we mentioned before. My sister Peggy has a daughter named Jessica who worked for years as a neonatal unit there at Children's Hospital. And a lot of these babies in there, the preemies, are there because of their mother was a druggie, and the child was delivered way premature, hanging on 3 and 4 pounds. It's sad. And they have a room full of babies, and there would be volunteers that would come in and spend hours every day doing just what? Holding these babies. Why? That's human nature. When does that get too old for you? You never grow out of that. Everybody wants that. And especially, having been involved in a nursing home ministry, especially, you can have old people walk through there, but when a young kid walks through there, what happens to these people? Man, they perk up. That's the reason why, in December, we go up there and pass out, teddy bears and things to those people. I mean, just see eyes light up because, it's a reminder of things, maybe a reminder of their own kids or their own youth and things like this. So God made us that way. We've been made in the image of God. We've got this great capacity to love and to be loved. And when you know and see examples of the love of God in your life, that's a tremendous motivator. And David said, to the point, when I've seen all this steadfast love of the Lord, the loving kindness, is greater than my lips shall praise you. Now, he wrote that on the run from King Saul. He was on the run for a number of years. One commentator said 13. I haven't added it up, but that seems to be reasonable. Saul wanted to kill him because he was jealous over things, and so he sent a posse after him, and there was all kinds of things. One time he goes down to the Philippines and acts like a crazy guy. You ever read about that, just try to maintain his safety. But then one time he's hiding in a cave and all that. But he wrote those words, Psalm 63, right in the midst of horrible persecution on the part of Saul. How could he do that? How could he do that? Because there was a need there. One of the students there today is 43. He spent a little bit of time in the Navy. And he'd already lined up to go to school. But he, at the age of 43, is already diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. At 43. And he apologized yesterday. If you see me start shaking, just know what that is. Sometimes it gets worse than others. And as we were walking out from class yesterday, I said, well, how are you handling that? He said, it's helped my faith more than anybody because I have to trust. And he mentioned today, telling the story of his conversion, there's not a day throughout the day because of what I now face, I trust the Lord. I lean on the Lord. I'm praying constantly to the Lord. So what has he been able to interpret that adversity has? He sees a greater need. And he'd mentioned in his lesson, the Apostle Paul's thorn in the flesh. What did the Apostle Paul say about his thorn in the flesh? Let's look at it. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. How could he deal with that? 3 times he asked of the Lord that it might be taken away. And the Lord said, my grace is sufficient for you. Look at verse 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, and needs, and persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What do you mean by that last page? When I'm weak, I'm strong. What's that? That's right, when you heard to go to God, and then you're relying not on your own strength, but on God's strength. I think you were going to say something, Luke, to answer that. You got some? Okay. And so that's what happens. I'm sure there are people in life that you've met, had some horrible things happen to them, but their faith was still strong, their faith was still sweet in the Lord. Like I mentioned, there's a lady down in South Haven. She'd been the wife of an elder for a number of years. When she was 38 years old, polio came back with a vengeance. She only weighed about 110 pounds, but she'd been confined to a bed. I've never in all my years seen a body more bent over and horrible to look at than her body. I mean, talk about the uncomfortable, just every day was hard. But I never met anybody down there who had a greater prayer life than her. And very few people can do that. It turned her whole trust in God. And it wasn't very long before B.J., most of you know who B.J. Clark is. He's now the director of the School of Preaching at Memphis, who was the preacher there. When some things happened, said, well, if you don't know anything, go talk to this lady. I said, who's she? I haven't met her. I said, yeah, she hadn't been able to come here for about 2 years because of polio, but she knows everything that's going on. I said, how would she know everything that's going on? Go see her and you'll find out. Not out of snooping, trying to find something to pass on a rumor. She cared. She had a son who was a deacon. She went over that bulletin town. Everybody was in that bulletin. She made calls. She wanted to find out how they are. Here was a prayer warrior praying, and she told me how many times she prayed for me. I can't wait to meet you, and we became good friends. And about 6 months after going there, got the young people, middle-aged school kids, to go over there and to start visiting nursing homes. We went to see her. And, they thought, well, this is going to be hard. But when they spent about an hour with her, they always wanted to go back and see her. She was doing more good for them than they were for her. They never seen anybody who have such faith. And that's the way it works. When there are things that you can't do on your own, and God has the ability to take care of that, then it shows his dependence. The last passage, 1 Corinthians 1, verse 26 through 31. We get an idea of how God thinks. Why would the Lord choose the disciples that he did? Instead of going to Jerusalem, school of preaching, take the last 12 valedictorians and people of power and influence, why did he choose fishermen and a political zealot and a tax collector? Why would he choose common, everyday, ordinary men to be his disciples instead of people who already had power and a reputation? Why would he do that? Well, this passage explains that. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world that can put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised, God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. What is it you think about the gospel that was probably the biggest shock in the wisdom of God? In the story of how God would redeem man, what instrument did he use that no one in his mind would have ever predicted God would use to be a central part of the message? The way he died on a cross. Before then, who died on the cross? Shameful, despised, no good people who didn't deserve to live died on a cross. They strip them naked, talk about a humiliating death, one of persecution, one of people just making fun of. Why would God choose to have God in the flesh die that horrible way? What's the message? That mankind would have never come up with that. That's not the way Hollywood would have done it. Why did God choose that? It shows the humility, but it also shows what? It shows, at the cross you see man at its worst, but God at his best, suffering. Suffering. What's that? We mention so often the two disciples on the road to Emmaus who blew it. And Jesus, when he gets them to the scriptures, he asks this question, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things? What kind of kingdom were they prepared for and wanted? An earthly kingdom. And to see Jesus suffering, that did not compute in their theology. But why would God use it? That's Will read Isaiah chapter 53 tonight to start the devotional time. The sign of a suffering Messiah. And the people in the early days of the church, coming up to the church. They didn't see that. They wanted what they wanted. They wanted a Jesus to do what? Take care of their physical needs, but first and foremost, why did he come? When John the Baptist saw Jesus come, what did he say? Behold, what was he going to take away? The sins of the world. That's what it was going to take to be able to show man in the plan of redemption. It was going to be involved suffering. Yes, Wooddale. Yeah. See, they don't understand that. They don't understand. But when if those of you that have had to go through and someone suffer for you, what does that do? As you grow up, you may not appreciate your mom and dad, but especially your mom. As you get older, and now maybe your mother or father on your own, having to stay up all night long, what do you begin to finally realize? How much your mother did for you when you stayed up, when you were sick for 3 days. Who missed sleep for 3 days and 3 nights? It was probably the sacrifices of what parents gave for you when you begin to appreciate what's been done. So I'm just saying, when people willingly suffer and take the punishment for you, that's when it gets your attention. That's when love is seen, because, what does it take who's a true friend, according to Jesus? Someone who would lay down their life for them. Sometimes we see, military movies and true stories, when someone would, a grenade plops in the foxhole and a guy would throw his body on it, he'll take the heat and die for his buddies. I mean, is that stupid? But there are people who do that. There are people who sacrifice, knowing they were going to die. They storm the beaches or try to accomplish some kind of military goal as a sacrifice for the for the group and for the country. And so freedom is a wonderful thing, but especially freedom for sin. Our time is up. You got to 8:01. That clock is slow. It's 8:05. I'm sorry. All right. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, we're going to take care of that young lady's need.